Welcome to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners optimize income, pay less in tax, and invest prudently. Here's your host, Grant Bledsoe.
Hello, everybody. Grant Bledsoe here. Welcome back to Grow Money Business. This week on the show, we're talking about Monte Carlo simulations. Not the casino kind, but the kind used in financial planning to help people determine whether they have enough money saved up to stop working and step into retirement. This is a really popular analytical tool used by the industry, but I think people put a little bit too much weight on the outcome of such analyses. So this week on the show, I wanted to run through what a Monte Carlo analysis actually was, where it comes from, what the assumptions are that are used in this kind of analysis, and really put some perspective into how much credence should we actually put into one of these things when you're making the important decisions surrounding your own retirement. I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, I need to interject quickly to remind you all that nothing found in today's episode or any other episode of Grow Money Business should be considered financial, investing, legal, tax, fitness, or even relationship advice. It's content that you're free to use and to deploy on your own terms. And before taking any actions on content found on the show, please do consult with your tax professional, your attorney, or your financial planner. If you don't have a financial planner, head on over to threeoakswealth.com to learn more about what we do in terms of financial planning and investments and how we help clients on an ongoing basis. Today on the show, we're talking about retirement. More specifically, Monte Carlo simulations, Monte Carlo analyses. There are a couple different terms, but if you've ever heard the words Monte Carlo in a financial setting before, that's what we're going to talk about today. Because this has come up in a couple recent discussions with our clients who are approaching retirement. And the reason that I wanted to focus on it today is because in general, I think a lot of people are putting way too much weight on the outcome of a quote unquote Monte Carlo analysis. And I'd like to talk about this issue in today's episode because this is really, really important as we proceed down the path toward our own retirement. You have your working years, you have income that's coming in, you pay taxes on that income. Whatever is left over is used to pay all your living expenses and your mortgage and vacations and all that. And hopefully you have a little bit left over to save and increase your wealth over time. And then as we transition into retirement, we take that income away, we stop working, and we kind of cross our fingers that the nest egg that you've built up, whatever you have in the bank accounts and 401ks and other investment accounts and Roth IRAs and all this stuff, we just kind of hope that that money is enough to last you the rest of your life, along with potentially Social Security benefits or maybe a pension mixed in there somewhere for some people. And that's a really daunting transition. It's scary, right? While you're working, you can always just work a little bit longer. You feel like you have control of the airplane because more is coming in than you need. And every additional paycheck that you earn is adding to that bottom line, your net worth. You have a little bit more in the bank, a little bit more in the investment accounts. And then we transition away from it. We're just kind of crossing our fingers. And so the question a lot of people have that we work with here in the office is, well, how do we confirm that we have enough? How do we know that this 700,000 or this 4 million or whatever the number is for you, how do we confirm that we have enough saved up so that we're not going to be destitute years on down the road? Because what we don't want is to run out of money, not be able to pay property taxes, lose the house, rely on our kids, rely on whatever state welfare systems are available to us. That's a really common fear people have when they make this transition into retirement. So the way that we think about this is, well, there's a lot of different ways that we can run the analysis. One rule of thumb that you may be familiar with is the 4% withdrawal rule as it relates to retirement spending. If you take out 4% of your portfolio every single year, 4% of what the portfolio was on day one. So if you have a $1 million portfolio, if you take $40,000 out in year one, And then in year 2, you take $40,000 plus inflation out. You take just 4% of your accounts out every single year over a 30-year retirement. If you're invested in 60% stocks, 40% bonds, then you're going to be in good shape. And that's a helpful rule of thumb. In practice, it's not really that useful or realistic, I found, because I think 95% of the people who are making this transition into retirement have spending needs that change over time. You might need to take out 5, 6, 7, 8% of your portfolio for the first couple of years. Maybe you're retiring at age 65 and you want to defer your Social Security benefits until you're age 70 to boost the benefit every year. Well, that means that you're not going to have that income between ages 65 and 70. Therefore, you might need to take a little bit more out of your accounts, and the distribution rate will be a little higher. But then after Social Security kicks on, then you won't have to take as much out later. Maybe you want to travel aggressively for the first 10 years of your retirement, take a little bit more money out then, and taper that spending as you get older and start slowing down a little bit, which inevitably just happens to all of us as human beings, of course. So in practice, the vast majority of people are going to need to adjust their retirement spending up and down over the course of their retirement. And that's why more elaborate forms of this analysis become really helpful when we're trying to answer that question of, hey, do I have do I have enough saved up to retire, or do I need to kick that can down the road, keep adding to the account for a few more years? Because as you know, every year longer that you work, you put a little bit more into the account, and you have theoretically one less year that those savings need to last you in retirement. If your life expectancy, if we're planning until age 95 and you're kicking around the idea of retiring at 65, well, if you just worked until 66, now you have a little bit more in the bank, and your savings only have to cover 29 years of living instead of 30 years. So that, from that perspective, the math is simple. But again, in reality, our lives are just more complex than that. And that's where Monte Carlo analysis comes into play. And to be frank, the industry has adopted a couple terms for this kind of analysis that I'm not a fan of. One of them is the name for this analysis itself. I don't know where the term Monte Carlo came from, but I don't like the fact that we use a gambling term. When I think of Monte Carlo, I think of casinos in Monte Carlo. I don't think of anything else. And I don't like to make an analogy between people's retirement and investment portfolios and gambling. That's apples to oranges and a little reckless, in my opinion. But that aside, what this means is that we are running a lot of different trials of various retirement projections and scenarios, and determining in how many of those trials did we reach the terminal life expectancy with money in the bank, versus how many of those trials did we work down your account balances to zero. And so how do we do that? Well, ordinarily you use a program that has a database of a whole bunch of market history. And the program that we use is called eMoney Advisor. It's very fancy, very elaborate, and they have this huge database of market returns for about 35 different asset classes over a long period of time. And the program enables us to create our own assumptions, which I'll get to here in just a minute if we want to make changes to this. But the default way that the program runs these analyses is it takes the index return. It uses an index as a proxy or benchmark for a given asset class. So for large cap stocks, it uses the S&P 500. And then it looks at the long-term return and standard deviation and correlation between all the other asset classes that are in the database. And so it knows that if you're only invested in large cap US stocks, it's going to apply the S&P 500's return and use that long-term historical return as an expectation going forward. Now, if you have half of your account in the S&P 500 and the other half of your account in large cap US stocks, and half of it in U.S. government bonds, then it's going to use the U.S. government bond index over a long-term period of time as a proxy for the future return on your bonds. And it knows because bonds and stocks are not perfectly correlated. They're not perfectly negatively correlated, but they do provide diversification benefit when you put them both into a portfolio. It knows what the long-term impact on your returns might be. And the program can, based on all the other inputs we put into it, when are you going to retire? What's in your accounts? How much do you need to take out of the accounts? What's your tax picture look like? How are those withdrawals from the accounts going to be taxed? How are costs going to go up over time? We can model all that stuff out. And when the program runs 1,000 trials in such a Monte Carlo analysis, it knows the probability, the aggregate probability that your portfolio might go up or down, or the standard deviation that it might be up by twice the long-term average versus down by twice the long-term average. These events happen. And so they run 1,000 trials with all that statistical firepower running in the background. And one trial might be, well, what if we have really bad timing and the market crashes on day one, and then we have great returns after that? How does all that fit? And then it models out, well, years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 through, let's say, 30 of retirement. Back to our example, if you're 65 or planning until 95, it's going to play that scenario out and determine whether your accounts were worked down to zero to fund your living expenses, or whether you hit age 95 with some money in the bank. So it does that 1,000 times. And then it ranks them in terms of outcome. If you have really fortunate timing and right after your retirement, the markets do great, the point when you have the longest to live and the most at stake, you have great returns, your nest egg grows. Maybe you can afford to take a little bit more money out at that point, but that's beside the point. Then you're going to have a better long-term outcome. On the other hand, if we have unfortunate timing, and this is where sequence of returns risk comes into play. If you have unfortunate timing, the market crashes when you have the longest time horizon and the most at stake, then the outcome is not going to be quite as good. And so the output of all this is you have 1,000 different trials, and the program tells you in how many of those trials did you hit age 95 with money in the bank, and how many of them did we work the accounts down to zero. The reason that this is helpful is this is much more elaborate and realistic than looking at your withdrawal rate in year one and comparing it to 4%. This kind of analysis enables us to tinker with different scenarios. I'm not sure if I have enough saved up to retire. What if we sold the vacation home and took the cash and added it to our portfolio after taxes? Does that give me enough to have a reasonable retirement outlook? Well, what if we kept the vacation home, but we spent $20,000 a year less? Well, what if we reduced our charitable gifts by this much? Or what if we did that? You can create any scenario that you want. And it's powerful because this is a more realistic picture of what we all tend to go through after we stop working and transition into retirement. So it's helpful from that regard. A lot of people, when we go through this, are interested in being an A student. They're overachievers. They really want to get ahead on their retirement. I want an A+ on the exam. I want a 100% chance of success. I don't think that's a good idea for most people. And I say that because most people have the objective of enjoying the fruits of their efforts. Most people don't want to kick the bucket 30 years down the road with $15 million in the bank. Most people don't want to minimize their own retirement, live on coupons and an extreme budget at the discount grocery store down the road in order to, give $10 million to each of their kids when they ultimately auger in way down the road, as one of my clients likes to say. there needs to be some balance, right? You want to enjoy the fruits of your labor. You don't want to spend everything down to zero too aggressively, but you probably want to have a reasonable amount of confidence that there's enough to last. Now, we do have clients that are really intent on bouncing the last check that they write too, and that's completely defensible, and I get it. You've worked your tail off to save all this money. You saved it for your future self. Well, guess what? You are your future self now. What better time to use it than the present? And that's a very reasonable thing to do too. Now, it doesn't leave much margin for error when you work your accounts close to zero over your life, but that's a reasonable thing to shoot for. So I don't like 0%. If we're relating this to a Monte Carlo, we run 1,000 trials. If 800 of those 1,000 trials result in you having money in the bank at age 95, then the result is an 80% quote unquote chance of success and a 20% quote unquote chance of failure. But if in 900 of those 1,000 trials you wind up with money in the bank, then it's a 90% chance of success, 10% chance of failure. I don't like to see A's on this exam. If you have above a 90%, that means that you're leaving too much meat on the bone. You have more of an opportunity to enjoy the fruits of your labor during your working years. I also don't like to see much below 60%. I don't feel comfortable with a coin flip 50-50. Somewhere around 70 to 80 to 85% is really where we like to live. Because at that point we have a whole lot of confidence based on the weight of history, the long-term weight of history, that you have enough saved up to last you the rest of your life. But at the same time, we're not being so miserly along the way that we're not enjoying ourselves, because we don't have a guarantee. We have no guarantees to live another week, much less another 30 years. So it's finding that balance point that's right for you. It's right for anyone in your situation. That's the key. Understand your values and your intentions, and then pick a place on that scale that makes the most sense. Now, term number 2, I mentioned I don't like the term Monte Carlo. The other term I really, really don't like, more so than using Monte Carlo to describe this thing, is chance of success versus chance of failure. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. If we run 1,000 trials and in 800 of them, you wind up with money in the bank at age 95, that's great. If 200 of those trials result in you having no money in the bank, working everything down to zero at some point, calling that a chance of failure is a very poor way to describe the situation. Because what you should be doing is, along the way, check in on this analysis and make sure that you continue to be on a strong trajectory, right? If your retirement plan is to save up $2 million, rely on Social Security, work until you're 70, and then take $80,000 out of the bank in year one, and $80,000 out of your, I say the bank, your portfolio, every year one and beyond. That's 4% of the $2 million, excuse me. Then circumstances say that you should be in pretty good shape. But what if we have a really, really bad economy and a really bad market, and we lose the dollar's status, the US dollar status as the reserve currency, and things just really fall into a tailspin? Well, you're not going to continue. If you wake up one day and you're 77 and the value of your portfolio is $400,000, you're not going to continue pulling 80 grand out of the accounts every single year. You're going to make some changes along the way, right? And this kind of analysis doesn't consider any of that. And so the whole point is, yes, this is it's a very helpful data point, but it needs to be reviewed and revised over time as your life evolves, as the world evolves, as the tax code changes, as all this stuff changes over multiple decades. Because you want to find that trajectory that makes sense for you as all these things happen. You're not going to continue burning it into the ground if things aren't looking so rosy. And so calling it a chance of success is poor titling. It should be chance of needing to make some kind of change. That makes a lot more sense to me. So realistically, we kind of have to put this into perspective. Now, that being said, these are a very It's a very helpful type of analysis. They have a lot of shortcomings, besides how they title, how these things are titled. Number one, the shortcomings are that the outcome of the analysis is only as good as the assumptions that you throw into the machine and you use. And there's a lot of consternation and discussion and argument over assumptions that go into the program amongst financial planning firms. I know big firms argue over this stuff all the time. They're only as good as what you put into them. At our firm, we use the long-term historical investment experience using the weight of history at our fingertips, which is about 150 years worth of stuff. In eMoney, they use slightly less than that. But that covers a whole, a whole bunch of historical and economic periods. It includes pre-World War II, post-World War II. It includes the US dollar as the world's reserve currency and not. It includes the US dollar against the gold standard and not. It includes high inflation. It includes low inflation. It includes the dot-com bubble. It includes the mortgage crisis. It includes the last, the 10-year period between the mortgage crisis and COVID, which was really, really strong for markets. It just includes a whole bunch of different stuff. And yeah, you can always make the argument that the next 100 years may not look as good as the last 100 years because we are maybe losing a little bit of political power in the global stage. Our capitalistic system is more mature than it once was. Maybe the tremendous growth is behind us. But over and over and over again, that just hasn't seemed to be the case. So we like to use the historical average, but not everybody goes that route. Some people will use expected long-term returns. JP Morgan does a good job. They have a great report every year where their team of economists and market tacticians gets together and produces their long-term return expectations by asset class. But somebody might want to use a higher forward-looking annual rate of inflation than another firm. And you might go to two different financial planning firms with the exact same inputs and get a drastically different output based on their interpretation of what assumptions should be tossed into the machine and how your situation is modeled. So it's subjective, is my point, right? That also kind of lends itself to the fact that we really need to continue running this kind of analysis periodically throughout your retirement. Stay on track and make sure you don't get too high on the trajectory to where you're missing out on opportunity to spend a little bit more, or you're too low on the trajectory and need to make a change before things get really, really bad for you. So the assumptions are subjective. You can't make the dynamic changes along the way, like I mentioned. If we're throwing assumptions into the program and then we're telling the program that they're all going to stay the same over the entire course of this 30 some odd year period. And that's simply not realistic. We're going to make changes along the way. So the other reason that we need to put this in perspective, and my whole point today was just to dive into this issue that I don't think we can bet our retirement on the outcome of one Monte Carlo simulation. It's helpful. It's just not the whole picture. We need to take a look at cash flow implications. What's the money in? What's the money out? What's the tax ramification? We need to look at the Monte Carlo chances of success versus chances of needing to make a change. Understanding where we sit with regard to all that. But realistically, the best form of analysis to use when you're doing this kind of thing, making sure that you have enough saved up so that you can stop working, make that transition into retirement. You need to use a yardstick that makes sense for your intentions. For someone whose intentions are, I want to make absolutely sure I never run out of money. That is the most important thing to me. I want to make sure that I never have to reduce my spending. Then, we should probably put the most weight in a Monte Carlo kind of analysis. But a lot of other people who are comfortable with that already might be more focused on minimizing taxes. What if your goal is, I really don't like how the government is using our tax dollars. I feel like I'm getting squeezed from all angles. A lot of people in California feel like, The environment is punitive against high income earners. They're trying to extract whatever they can, however they can from you. And your goal might be to minimize the amount that you're required to fork over to state, federal, and or local authorities through taxes. That's a really defensible way too. And for that kind of analysis, you should probably not use Monte Carlo. You want to rely more on long-term tax projections and how that plays against your mandatory distributions from 401ks, IRAs, and that kind of thing. You map out every single year, where is the money going to come from? How much are you going to be forced to take out of your IRAs, 401ks once you hit, your mid-70s or thereabouts? And how is that going to impact your tax picture? And then you brainstorm different scenarios of, well, what kinds of things could we do to reduce taxes? What if we started giving stock to charity or to our donor advised fund? What if we did those Roth conversions that Grant keeps talking about over and over and over again on his podcast? What if we harvested gains and losses a little bit more strategically in our taxable accounts? What long-term impact does that have on our taxes? That's probably more relevant to you than relying on the Monte Carlo analysis of, well, in how many of these trials did I wind up with money in the bank at 95 and how many of them did I not? Another aim for a lot of people is what strategy is going to enable me to take the very most out of my accounts every single year. And that's correlated to chance of success in a Monte Carlo, but it's not the exact same thing. I want to get the most utility out of my savings. I want to be able to go off and buy the nice boat and fly first class as opposed to economy. What is the strategy? What's the route that's going to allow me to do that? And so what I'm getting at here is there are multiple angles, multiple forms of analysis that people need to consider here when you're weighing the different options. And Monte Carlo is just one of them. The options are, do I retire this year? Do I retire a little later? If you're a business owner, maybe what's the difference between selling my business to a third party and putting my employees' jobs at risk, but getting more money versus selling to someone internally, getting less money, preserving their jobs and maybe not collecting it all up front? How does that play into your personal financial situation? What are your objectives? So everybody's situation is different, but there are multiple forms of analysis and different options that you have, right? And so to reach the best long-term conclusion, the best long-term outcome for yourself and your family, just model out what these different options that you have at your fingertips look like. What does it look like to sell to a third party long-term versus selling internally and deferring some of the cash coming in, holding the note on the business, and preserving your employees' jobs? Well, what does the Monte Carlo look like? What are the tax implications? What does the cash flow look like? What are your withdrawal rates doing? How much is going to be left over at the end in any of those environments? You need to approach this issue from multiple different angles is my point. Monte Carlo is one of them. So I hope I didn't beat that horse to death too badly, but it is a helpful thing. We use it almost every day in our office. We use it in every single retirement plan that we help people with. My point is it's not the only one, and there are other points to consider because that is far from perfect. Okay, I hope this was helpful. Feel free to give us a ring if you have questions about your Monte Carlo simulation, and otherwise, I will talk to you all again soon.
Thanks for tuning in to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners optimize income, pay less in tax, and invest prudently. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever you digest podcasts to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes and announcements, and feel free to submit questions to growmoneybusiness.com.